Greetings, church family. Today's daily Bible reading had us in Genesis chapters 27 and 28. And of course, a very familiar story in chapter 27. Jacob fulfilling his name, the one who takes by the heel, or the one who supplants. If you go back to Genesis chapter 25, remember the prophecy given by Yahweh to their parents, especially to Rebekah, their mother. Two nations are in your womb, verse 23 says. Two peoples will be separated from your body. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Of course, twins Esau and Jacob. Esau comes out first, and his brother is holding on to his heel, verse 26. Esau getting named for his red skin or hair, perhaps, and his brother holding on to his heel, being named as the one who supplants. And this prophecy does come true. We see it in chapter 27, Jacob supplanting Esau. At the end of chapter 25, Esau had sold his birthright for some stew, bread and lentil stew. That's what he gave it up for. And so Jacob has the birthright in a very dubious manner, and it gets worse here as his mother conspires with Jacob to have him steal Esau's birthright. And the birthright would have been very, very vitally important to that ancient culture. Even some cultures today around the world would still value a birthright incredibly so, and that is given to the firstborn. Well, what happens in chapter 27? We see that interestingly enough, both blessing and deception are the two themes that are happening at the same time. In fact, the word for bless here in Hebrew is barak, which is related to the word barek, and barek means kneel, and that's the idea. It's someone kneeling to receive the blessing. Barak appears, some form of it appears 23 times in chapter 27 alone, a few more times in the beginning of chapter 28. And yet we see the deception going all the way through as well. Even Jacob realizes, as Rebekah, who favors him, Jacob realizes that this is deception. He says it in verse 12. Perhaps my father will feel my skin, and I'll be as a deceiver in his sight, because he was not hairy like his brother. He knows that this is deception. He's not being tricked into it by his mother. He's fully on board with it. Rebekah favors Jacob. Isaac favors Esau. And so what happens? Well, Jacob comes and he really lies, if you look, 5 different times to his father, a few times verbally and a few times non-verbally. Let's look at those briefly, verses 18 through 26, in order to get this blessing. He went and of course, was able to take a goat that his mother gave in order to turn it into a stew, some young goats, and a nice dish for the father. The father was expecting that this would be game that Esau's bringing. Esau was the hunter, and Jacob was more of a stay-at-home young man who decided to go that route instead of being a hunter, keeping flocks and such. And so Jacob's first lies in verse 19. He actually tells Isaac, I am Esau, your firstborn. I've done that you told me. So get up, please, sit, eat of my game, that you may bless me. Another lie. Isaac asks, how were you able to do that so fast? Okay, hunting takes a long time, as those of you who hunt know. You can't just go out real quick and shoot something and bring it right back and then have it all prepared and you eat it. So Isaac asks that very question. How'd you able to do it so quickly? Second lie by Jacob in verse 20. Because Yahweh your God caused it to happen to me. Oh my goodness. So he's actually using the Lord's name to try and twist this truth, right? To make this lie into something that Isaac is going to believe. And that is so terrible, to lie, to deceive, and then to, on top of that, invoke God's name as a sort of stamp of approval, or here, you got to really believe it. So terrible indeed. And yet we've been guilty of the same thing, haven't we? Remember, lying goes all the way back to Satan, the father of lies, Scripture calls him. Well, Jacob lies again as Isaac continues to kind of ask these questions and try to perceive. He knows something's up. You can see it by all the ways he asks questions. But look at verse 22. We get a nonverbal lie, a lie of omission that Jacob does not correct. Jacob came close to Isaac his father, and he felt him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He had put some wool, some hair onto his hands to make it look like or feel like he had this goat skin. It would feel as if he was hairy. We get another lie, verse 24. Isaac said, "Are you really my son Esau?" And he said, "I am." So another verbal lie. And finally, the fifth lie in verse 27. He came close and kissed him. When he smelled the smell of his garments, he blessed him and said, and gives the blessing right there that he would have given to Esau, that he thought he was giving to Esau. And again, even that smell was something that Jacob and Rebekah had planned out. Verse 15, Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her elder son. And Isaac was able to recognize the smell of his son. And so 2 nonverbal lies, 3 verbal lies, and we get this blessing. And this blessing is consistent, really, with that prophecy that was given to Rebekah. Jacob is going to have others bow down to him. He's going to be master of his brothers, verse 29 says. And indeed, this is what happens. Esau is upset when he finds out what's happened, as you might imagine, crying out with an exceeding great and bitter cry. You might wonder, well, the blessing wasn't very important to him back when he was starving. And yet he clearly sees here that we see that he is definitely upset. He's been supplanted twice by Jacob, deceived twice, once taken advantage of more than anything, and then this time deception to his father Isaac. Isaac gives him what he can at this point. He says that you're going to be more of a warrior. By your sword you're going to live. There's going to be a lot of strife. We see this because the descendants of Esau are going to be later named the Edomites, and they pop up over and over again throughout the Old Testament, again in opposition to the people of Israel, which Jacob will have his name changed to later on in the book of Genesis. Esau bears a grudge against Jacob, verse 41. We see consequence of sin, don't we? Consequence of sin. Rebekah tells Jacob to flee to Haran, to brother Laban. We see later on that both the parents are upset because of Esau in chapter 26 had married Canaanite women, Hittites, which would have been of the Canaanites. And Abraham had specifically told his son, Isaac, right, their father, these boys' father, way back in chapter 24, verse 3, don't take from Canaanite women, go to other descendants or relatives, at least, of Abraham, so that they would hopefully be God-fearers, is the implication. Don't marry, and we see this over and over again, don't marry foreign women throughout the Old Testament, because those foreign women would be worshiping a different god. It was nothing to do with any sort of skin color, ethnicity issue, even though we did see that many Jews would become racist over time throughout the Old Testament. Jonah comes to mind particularly. But Rebekah's upset. Rebekah's upset of these daughters of Heth, doesn't want these Canaanite women, these Hittite women, anyone from the land of Canaan to be those that Jacob chooses to marry. So eventually he goes off to Laban, and we're going to see his adventures there in chapter 29. But in the meantime, Esau tries to get some favor back, doesn't he? In chapter 28, he tries to get some favor back with his father. Esau saw, verse 8, that the daughters of Canaan displeased his father Isaac, and Esau went to Ishmael and married, besides the wives that he had, Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth. So bringing it back into the family, thinking that, my grandfather Abraham's wish that he gave to my father Isaac, surely this will get me back into his good graces. You can see that was most likely the idea that Esau had there. Then we get to Jacob, not Jacob's ladder, of course, but this ladder to heaven that he has this vision. Very interesting. In verse 12, he had a dream. Behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the implication here is the constant presence of the spiritual realm all around us, even though we do not see it. And that's very important to keep in mind. And we see the spiritual realm over and over in the Old Testament and New Testament, both. Just think of passages of Scripture like in Isaiah 14 and in Ezekiel where we see human kings actually kind of back to back with some spiritual force behind, namely Satan that's being listed. In the book of Daniel, we see these spiritual forces at work in some mighty battles that are happening in the spiritual realm, which are resulting in strife in the physical realm between mankind, between Israel and other nations. And of course, we see Paul's admonition to an instruction to the Christians. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against spiritual forces. That's who our fight is against. And so we see that with that ladder there, that implication. Jacob is very excited. He wakes up from this dream, says Yahweh was in this place, verse 16 of chapter 28. I did not know it. He was afraid, said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So the name gets changed from Luz, which means to, the Hebrew word is referring to kind of to let it go, to let out of sight. And he changes it to literally house of God, Beth El. And every time you see Beth or Beth in the Old Testament, that's referring to house. So Bethlehem would be house of bread, is what that is. And Bethel, then, Bethel, would be house of God, literally. El being short for Elohim, often used as to refer to God. He sets up a stone as a pillar to remind him that the Lord met him there, spoke to him there, and kind of glossed over it real quick, but going back into chapter 28, what do we see? The Abrahamic Covenant now promised through Isaac, now to Jacob. Behold, Yahweh stood above it, verse 13, said, I am Yahweh, the God of your father, Abraham, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth. You will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I'm with you and will keep you wherever you go, will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And we're going to see later on when there's the famine and Joseph is in Egypt and Jacob and his family actually leave the land, the promise is given and the whole tribes of Israel hold on to that promise, and God reminds them of it in the book of Exodus. He's going to bring them back to this land. But that same Abrahamic covenant language, you could clearly hear it there, that God gave to Abraham and then repeated to Abraham in reference to Isaac, and then now has repeated to Jacob. We'll continue on. Some principles that we get from this passage, we see God's grace on display, don't we? And we've been seeing that consistently throughout the Old Testament so far. His grace that even though there's consequences of sin, and we see that in these passages as well, and even though that God disciplines those who sin against him, we see his grace also. He could have killed Adam and Eve right away. He did not. He could have killed Cain right away. He did not. Over and over again, he could have struck down Noah's youngest son who had seen him naked and laughed, but he did not. Over and over, Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Esau and Rebekah, and they've all been kept alive by the Lord. He's shown grace to them, and he's using them in his sovereign will. And that's the interesting thing, right? God's grace on display. He still blesses Jacob through Isaac, and he gives Jacob, still chooses Jacob as the one that the Abrahamic covenant would continue through. He doesn't withhold it from him, and yet remember, it's for his own purposes. We also see that God is not distant, is he? He is near, and that's that ladder to heaven imagery we have there. God is near. He's got active interest in this world. He is sending his messengers to and fro all over, though we can't see them. And he's taking this active interest not because we have interest in it, but rather it's for his own purposes, which certainly does include those he's made in his image and those who he has elected unto salvation through Jesus Christ, his son. We also see, though, that sin does have consequences. We see the favoritism of the parents, Isaac and Rebekah, having consequences on their children. We see the lying taking place, the theft of what did not belong. That blessing did not belong to Jacob, and he stole it from Esau through that deception. And there's consequences. There's a grudge now between Jacob and Esau. There's anger. There's fury. This is a family that is now broken and separated, and will never have perfect peace later on in this world, as we see. The descendants of Esau will be against the descendants of Jacob. And so we can respond today with a worship of the Lord for his grace that he extended through his son, Jesus Christ. And with a greater trust in the Lord, he is near. He does care. He cares for our plight. He cares what's going on. He constantly is involved in what is going on in this world. He is not just cold and aloof and distant. He is near, and sin has consequences. Let us trust the Lord and obey him, knowing that, yes, God is gracious, and he is willing to forgive, and he's ready to forgive. But why would we sin against our great God who has done so much for us? Why would we do that? If we truly love him, if we truly want to worship him, we'll seek to be holy as he is holy. And if we need that further reminder, here we have it. Sin has consequences, and they will play out in this world. Well, I hope this has been very productive for you today and helpful, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.